It started as a quiet morning, but it was about to become Ty Borden's ultimate test. He thought he was ready. Yesterday's small win had sparked something in him, real hope that he could rebuild his skills, reclaim his veterinary license, and once again walk the path he had walked before the accident, the amnesia, the years lost. But confidence is a fragile thing, and in Heartland, life has a way of challenging you just when you start to believe again. A call came in. Emergency. A horse in severe distress. And for the first time in 4 years, Ty would face it alone. Ty had just started his day, sitting at the breakfast table with Amy, Lindy, and Lisa, when the phone rang. The number was familiar. Scott Cardinal. Ty answered casually, expecting another chance to observe, maybe assist. But Scott's voice was urgent. Emergency at the Brennan Ranch. Severe colic. I'm over 45 minutes out on a calving. I need you to go. Assess, stabilize, and keep the horse alive until I get there. Ty's heart thudded. Alone? No backup? This wasn't an observation. This was it. The real thing. No safety net. But somewhere inside, despite the panic rising, he found himself saying, Yes, I can do that. He grabbed his kit, ran for the truck. Amy called after him, concern etched on her face, but Ty tried to smile. Tried to be the version of himself he used to be. Confident, capable, reliable. But even as he drove, his hands trembled slightly on the wheel. This was more than a medical emergency. This was a crossroads. Murphy, the horse in question, was in agony. Frank Brennan met Ty at the barn, his voice anxious, eyes wide with helplessness. Ty entered the stall and saw the worst-case scenario, pawing, rolling, sweating profusely. Everything screamed severe colic. He began the exam immediately, pushing past the fear. Vital signs were off the charts. Gut sounds, absent. A silent gut is a warning sign in any case, but here it was a blaring alarm. Rectal palpation revealed distended intestine. The kind of thing that could mean several diagnoses, and only one would be the right one. With Scott not yet there, the weight of the decision fell squarely on Ty's shoulders. The call he made next would decide life or death. Severe impaction, he said out loud. We start treatment immediately. Pain meds, mineral oil, nasogastric tube. Everything he had been trained to do, everything he remembered, everything he could bring to bear, he used, and for a few minutes it seemed like it might work. He even called Scott to report his diagnosis and plan. Scott trusted him, gave him the green light to proceed. That trust meant the world to Ty. But minutes later, it all began to fall apart. Murphy didn't improve. In fact, the horse got worse. Agitated, thrashing, vitals deteriorating rapidly. Ty watched, helpless, as his certainty began to crumble. What if he was wrong? What if this wasn't impaction at all? Ty's hands were shaking. He tried to keep the horse safe, tried to keep him from rolling and causing fatal internal damage. But deep down, he knew. He knew something was terribly wrong. And by the time Scott arrived, the truth hit him like a blow to the chest. There was no time to dwell on the mistake. Not yet. Ty shoved the crushing guilt aside and focused on helping Scott get Murphy loaded into the emergency trailer. The horse, barely standing, was drenched in sweat and quivering from pain. Scott worked fast, his experience on full display, issuing rapid instructions that Ty followed with silent urgency. It was a blur of hooves, straps, and movement, and then the trailer door slammed shut. Sirens wailing, lights flashing, Scott pulled away, leaving Ty to follow in his own truck, heart racing and stomach twisted in knots. Every second of the drive was torment. He replayed the moment of diagnosis over and over in his head, remembering the feel of that distension, the certainty that had filled him, the way he'd told himself he was ready. But he hadn't been. That was clear now. One wrong call, one missed clue. And if Murphy didn't make it, that mistake would haunt him for the rest of his life. At the surgical facility, he sat in the truck, unable to walk through the doors. He didn't deserve to stand beside Scott. He didn't deserve to call himself a veterinarian, not after this. Hours passed, 3 long, soul-crushing hours. When Scott finally came out, his face was pale with exhaustion. Ty braced for the worst, but somehow, against the odds, Murphy had made it. Barely. Another 30 minutes and it would have been too late. Significant tissue damage, emergency resection, but the horse would live. Relief hit Ty like a wave, but it was buried under a mountain of shame. "I almost killed him," Ty said, voice flat, staring down at his shaking hands. "If you'd been later." Scott cut him off. "But I wasn't." And the horse didn't die. He put a firm hand on Ty's shoulder. "You made a mistake." Under pressure. Every vet does. By late afternoon, Ty had vanished into himself. He went through the motions, offered a few strained comments during memorial planning with the family, even nodded at a design suggestion from Ashley during a video call. But his mind was locked inside the 4 walls of that barn stall, with Murphy thrashing on the ground and his own hands shaking, paralyzed between hope and horror. It wasn't just about getting a diagnosis wrong. It was what the mistake meant. That he was a danger. That he wasn't ready. That maybe he never would be. At dinner, Amy gently probed again, but Ty shut it down with a clipped explanation. The horse had been saved. He made an error. It was corrected. End of story. But it wasn't the end. Not for him. Afterward, he retreated to the library, surrounded by the textbooks and flashcards that had once brought him hope. Now they mocked him. All those hours, all that study, and in the one moment that mattered most, none of it had been enough. He sat in the dark, the room silent, but for the whisper of pages turning in his memory. Pages filled with facts he knew by heart, but couldn't apply when it counted. The more he thought, the worse it got. His mind twisted the events, amplifying his guilt until it became unbearable. That's where Lindy found him, quiet, still, shattered. She didn't hesitate. Turned on the lamp, sat across from him like they always did during study time. But there would be no quizzes tonight. No reviews, just truth. Ty tried to deflect, but Lindy saw right through him. She always did. And with the wisdom of someone far older than her years, she told him a story. About Jack. About how she'd once failed over and over again trying to ride, and how Jack hadn't let her give up. About how failure wasn't the opposite of progress. It was part of it. Ty listened, first with resistance, then with a heart cracking open. Her words didn't change what had happened, but they shifted something, gave the pain room to be something more than self-punishment, made space for the possibility that failure wasn't final, that maybe he could still try again. Lindy didn't just talk that night, she challenged him. With quiet, unwavering love, she reminded Ty that rebuilding wasn't supposed to be easy, that Jack had failed too, that Amy had fallen apart and gotten back up, that every person they admired in their lives had been forged in fire, not comfort. Her words weren't empty. They were earned from living with people who had overcome real darkness. And slowly, like light creeping through a crack, something inside Ty shifted. The crushing weight didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. He realized he didn't have to be perfect right now. He just had to keep going, keep learning, keep trying. That night, instead of wallowing in self-pity, he made a decision. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to Scott. A simple request, but one that took courage. Need to talk about formal training plan. Today showed me I can't just study and observe. I need structured mentorship if I'm going to be safe to practice. Can we meet this week? Scott replied quickly. Absolutely. I was going to suggest the same. Come by the clinic Wednesday. We'll build a proper program. Reading those words, Ty felt something strange. Hope. Real hope. Not the blind kind that comes from wanting to believe, but the grounded kind that comes from deciding to act. When he finally made it upstairs to bed, Amy was still awake, waiting. He told her everything. The mistake, the fallout, the choice to move forward. Her response wasn't pity. It was pride. "I'm proud of you for asking for help," she said softly. That takes more strength than pretending you're fine. And Ty, for the first time that day, believed her. He had failed, yes, but failure wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a painful, necessary one. And tomorrow, he would take the first step into that new beginning, not alone, but with his family, his mentors, and his own hard-earned humility. But somehow, against the odds, Murphy had made it. Barely. Another 30 minutes and it would have been too late. Significant tissue damage, emergency resection. But the horse would live. Relief hit Ty like a wave, but it was buried under a mountain of shame. "I almost killed him," Ty said, voice flat, staring down at his shaking hands. "If you'd been later," Scott cut him off. "But I wasn't, and the horse didn't die." He put a firm hand on Ty's shoulder. "You made a mistake." Under pressure, every vet does, even the best of us. But Ty couldn't hear it. His mind was too loud, telling him he wasn't ready, that he'd never be ready, that this dream of returning to the profession was just a fantasy, that he had no business treating animals, that his hands, once so sure, were now dangerous. Back at Fairfield, the world kept spinning. Amy had taken the day off, really rested for the first time in months. She'd gone for a peaceful ride through the trails, let her body and mind relax for once. The sun rose on a new day at Fairfield, casting light across the slowly forming memorial and the not-yet-completed barn, a symbol of something rising again, something being built from ashes. Ty stood quietly at the window that morning, coffee cooling in his hands, eyes on the horizon. He wasn't magically healed. The doubt still whispered, the fear still lingered, but the paralysis was gone, because now he had a plan. He would meet with Scott, not as someone pretending to be whole, but as someone willing to admit what he lacked and ready to do the work. Amy joined him by the window, her presence grounding him. They didn't need words. She knew he wasn't giving up, and that was enough. Lindy came bounding in, flashcards in hand. "Quiz time," she declared. Ty smiled for the first time that morning. Yes, he would study. Yes, he would train. Yes, he would fall again. But he would also rise. That day, he sat down with Scott at the clinic. They outlined a structured mentorship. Ty would shadow emergencies, not just observe, but discuss every decision. Weekly case reviews, hands-on assessments with Scott watching, and, most importantly, space to fail safely. Ty left that meeting not with restored confidence, but with something more valuable: clarity. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was real. Back home, Amy was working with a new horse. A rescue. Traumatized, skittish, hard to reach. Watching her gently coax it out of fear reminded Ty of himself. Progress wasn't about force, it was about time, trust, consistency. That night, the family gathered again. Amy, Lisa, Caleb, Lindy. Even Ashley joined by video. They finalized more memorial details, chose passages from Jack's journals, settled on a quote from Marion's training notes. And as they talked about legacy, Ty finally felt like he was part of it again. Not a ghost from the past trying to reclaim something lost, but a man rebuilding something new. The episode ended with Ty and Amy sitting on the porch, the stars above them, the wind carrying the soft scent of hay and wood and change. Amy leaned into him and whispered, "You're doing it." One step at a time. And Ty, with a heart still bruised but no longer broken, whispered back, "Yeah." One step at a time. Because sometimes, proving yourself isn't about getting it right the first time. It's about what you do after you get it wrong. And Ty Borden, like Jack Bartlett before him, was built to get back up, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. Scott worked fast, his experience on full display, issuing rapid instructions that Ty followed with silent urgency. It was a blur of hooves, straps, and movement, and then the trailer door slammed shut. Sirens wailing, lights flashing, Scott pulled away, leaving Ty to follow in his own truck, heart racing and stomach twisted in knots. Every second of the drive was torment. He replayed the moment of diagnosis over and over in his head, remembering the feel of that distension, the certainty that had filled him, the way he'd told himself he was ready. But he hadn't been. That was clear now. One wrong call, one missed clue, and if Murphy didn't make it, that mistake would haunt him for the rest of his life. At the surgical facility, he sat in the truck, unable to walk through the doors. He didn't deserve to stand beside Scott. He didn't deserve to call himself a veterinarian. Not after this. Hours passed. 3 long, soul-crushing hours. When Scott finally came out, his face was pale with exhaustion. Ty braced for the worst. But somehow, against the odds, Murphy had made it. Barely. Another 30 minutes and it would have been too late. Significant tissue damage, emergency resection, but the horse would live. Relief hit Ty like a wave, but it was buried under a mountain of shame. "I almost killed him," Ty said, voice flat, staring down at his shaking hands. "If you'd been later—" Scott cut him off. "But I wasn't. And the horse didn't die." He put a firm hand on Ty's shoulder. "You made a mistake." Under pressure. Every vet does, even the best of us. But Ty couldn't hear it. His mind was too loud, telling him he wasn't ready, that he'd never be ready, that this dream of returning to the profession was just a fantasy, that he had no business treating animals, that his hands, once so sure, were now dangerous. Back at Fairfield, the world kept spinning. Amy had taken the day off, really rested for the first time in months. She'd gone for a peaceful ride through the trails, let her body and mind relax for once. Lisa had made lunch. They'd even smiled, talked about the memorial, laughed. But when Ty returned, everything shifted. He looked hollow, his face drawn, his eyes distant. And though Amy tried to ask what had happened, he gave her the barest answer. "Horse is fine." Scott saved him. "I need to make some calls." Then he disappeared into the house, avoiding everyone, avoiding her, because he wasn't just shaken. He was broken, and no one could reach him yet. There was no time to process what had just happened, no time to sit in the guilt that was already rising in Ty's chest like a storm. As soon as Scott delivered the diagnosis, intestinal torsion, everything became a blur of urgency. They had minutes, maybe less, before Murphy's condition tipped past the point of no return. Together, Ty and Scott got to work, guiding the near-collapse horse into the trailer. Ty moved on instinct, not confidence, following Scott's firm commands, his own hands shaking with adrenaline and dread. Once the trailer pulled away, sirens screaming into the distance, Ty climbed into his truck and followed behind, his thoughts unraveling with every mile. He stared out at the road ahead, but saw only the scene he'd left behind. The moment the horse had collapsed, the horror in Frank Brennan's eyes, the searing weight of being wrong when it mattered most. That ride felt endless. His stomach churned. He kept trying to justify it, trying to replay the exam in his mind. Had it really felt like impaction? Was there a sign he missed? Something he ignored? But no matter how he looked at it, the answer stayed the same. He'd gotten it wrong, and if Scott had arrived even 20 minutes later, Murphy would have died. Ty's mistake wouldn't have just been a misstep. It would have been fatal. At the clinic, Ty didn't even go inside. He stayed in his truck, slumped over the steering wheel, numb, suffocating under the weight of what he'd nearly caused. The longer he sat, the deeper the pit inside him grew. He'd failed. Not just in diagnosis, but in judgment, in readiness, in knowing his own limits. For months he'd convinced himself that rebuilding his skills was enough. That study, shadowing, and determination would bring him back to who he was before. But today had shown the truth. Books couldn't prepare you for the real weight of a life in your hands. When Scott finally emerged 3 hours later, covered in sweat and fatigue, Ty forced himself upright. His throat was dry. He couldn't even form the question. Scott answered it anyway. He made it. Just barely. We had to remove a section of intestine. It was close, Ty. Real close. The relief was instant. and completely overshadowed by the flood of shame. Ty didn't feel victory. He didn't feel relief. He felt the weight of almost. Almost too late. Almost fatal. Almost unforgivable. "I almost killed him," he said, voice hollow, staring down at his hands, hands that used to be steady, skilled, trusted. "You didn't," Scott replied. "That horse is alive." "Because you acted. Because you tried." But Ty shook his head. The words couldn't reach him. Not yet. Because the voice in his head was louder than Scott's. That voice didn't speak forgiveness or understanding. It screamed failure. Coward. Pretender. You'll never be good enough again. Back at Fairfield, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Amy had taken her first real day off in months. She rode through the trails, no deadlines, no training plans, just her and a gentle mare named Bella moving through the crisp fall air. For the first time in what felt like forever, Amy breathed, truly breathed. She returned to a simple lunch, soft laughter with Lisa, planning the memorial with Lindy. There was peace, restoration, joy. But it shattered the moment Ty stepped through the door. Amy knew before he spoke that something had gone horribly wrong. His expression was gray, his eyes distant. He gave her only the surface. "Horse is okay." Scott saved him. "I need to make some calls." Then he vanished into the house like a ghost, a man haunted by something he couldn't outrun. Amy exchanged a worried glance with Lisa, but didn't follow. She knew that look. The storm needed time to burn through. Ty wasn't ready to speak it yet, wasn't ready to let the wound bleed in front of anyone. And the worst part? He wasn't just grieving the near loss of a horse. He was grieving something deeper. The fragile hope he'd built that maybe, just maybe, he was ready. That hope had been shattered in a single moment. And now, all he could see in himself was a man who should have known better.